In this episode, we're exploring a character, or should we say, characters, who embody the ultimate struggle between good and evil. He is the brilliant but tormented scientist, and he is also his twisted, malevolent, uninhibited alter ego. We're talking, of course, about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Here we go! And here we are again for the greatest characters in pop culture history. Today we are talking about Jekyll and Hyde, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And my guest today is Charles Baruch. He is a great writer. He has a new Western out, which he's written as David Baruch, called Theo Starr versus the Culver Gang. And he has a new horror collection, which I hope you all go to Amazon to pick up. It's called Shadows Without Light, and Charles is holding up a cover of it right now. And he's also one of the hosts of this great horror podcast called Horror Words Podcast. He is holding up a QR code, so if you want to go to that, it will take you right to it. There's a great number of episodes, great guests talking about horror writing. And what a better segue to what we're going to be talking about today. This is one of the classics of horror fiction. It's a novella by Robert Louis Stevenson, known for Treasure Island, Kidnapped, but I would argue that this is probably his best known work. Would you say so, Charles?
I would say so, but since you introduced me as a writer, I kind of have to talk about the writing before we talk about the character.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. If Mr. Stevenson were part of my writing group, I would take him aside, put my arm around his shoulder, and go, "Bob, you've done a lot of things wrong." So, to be fair, the biggest sin that he commits wasn't a sin when he wrote it, it's just a sin the way we look at books now. He literally goes out of his way to tell us how boring the main character is. Now, in his time, what he's trying to say is this is a man who would give no man offense, he is a true gentleman. But he literally says there's not an interesting thing about him. He doesn't know how to smile. The one thing to his credit is every friend of his who's on a downslide, he's the last guy to abandon them. But there's no mention that he ever stops the downslide, that in any way he contributes to these people's lives being better. And the way he introduces him and his cousin, they look like two throwaway characters there for a prologue. And if you put a gun to my head and said, which one's going to be the main character? I'd say neither of these two, but if you insist, it must be the cousin. Mm-hmm. Because he's the one with the personality.
Right.
And yet somehow that's not what we got.
Yeah. I mean, you would think Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, okay, Dr. Jekyll maybe should be the main character, but he is, the way it's written, he's like this secondary character that everyone is talking about. This is told initially, right, from the point of view of Mr. Utterson, right? This bland kind of character, right? And he is getting all his information from other people, right? So his cousin tells him what they saw, and it's so much exposition too, right? So in this day and age, you'd want to show it, and we'll get into that about how really this novella isn't necessarily the source that people go to when they're adapting movie versions and all these other things. They're going to like the play that came afterwards, which I'll talk about. But so talk more about that. Like, everybody kind of knows the story, right? There's this doctor takes this potion and becomes this different, wicked kind of side to their personality that people don't even recognize. Physical appearance changes. The stature, they're supposed to, Hyde is supposed to be shorter than Jekyll. But in the original story, that was the surprise twist ending. Nobody knew until the last act that they were the same person.
Twist is the word, because there's a lot of evidence that he was trying to write a mystery and just didn't do a very good job of it. Seriously, I would put my arm around Bob and go, we got a lot of things to talk about in your writing. Because he's clearly not writing true horror, because everything bad that happens off camera. To your point, he hears about it from other people. He's not, we don't see anything bad happen. So he's not really writing horror. And he's not really writing straight fiction because it has this very big and critical twist in it. It really looks like he's trying to write it as, the strange case, literally a mystery case, a
Right.
mystery story. But it doesn't do the things a mystery story needs to do, like give you really credible red herrings. It does not give you multiple suspects. It does not give you an examination of the murder scene. So I looked at it and I was like, okay, I know what's going on here. Obviously, like Dickinson, he did this serialized, and he got stuck with what he wrote. And then I looked it up, and no, he didn't.
Because that's what I thought too. I thought I was looking it up, and I was like, this was done in parts, had to have been done. And I was like, no, he did it like in this fever week or however many times. Some people.
Worse than that. The mythology is that he wrote the whole thing. His wife critiqued it. He burned the manuscript
Right.
and then rewrote it, which means this is a second draft at minimum.
Imagine what that first one would have been like. Who knows? But yeah, he had allegedly a dream, and that's where some of the ideas came from. And then there's different stories. He was apparently sick for this week where he was bedridden, and some people say he might have been on like some kind of drugs or something, because a lot of people look at this as maybe an allegory about drug abuse. So there's a lot of stories about how this came to be. But yeah, that's one of those stories that apparently he did throw into the fire, that first draft that he wrote.
Yeah.
So that's really interesting.
Oh, yeah.
So back in the time, you think about inspiration and what might have inspired him. There was Darwin's theory was really popular in that Victorian era, and a lot of the people mistook it and misunderstood what Darwin meant by that. And they thought, okay, he's saying that human beings evolved from apes or came directly from apes. So there was that notion that maybe this is a story about de-evolution, where he's experimenting and taking human beings, going back to their kind of more primitive state. There's obviously the allegory side of it, like he's talking about something else. And apparently there was a Jekyll in his life. There was this pastor named Jekyll.
I didn't know.
So people like, was he looking at that kind of hypocrisy that a lot of people have kind of looked at now in certain people, whether they're government officials, civil servants, priests, or pastors, and they're living a double life, right? The fact that there are really no women in this story that he tells. In the play version that comes afterwards, they add like his fiance and all these other female characters, strong female characters that become part of the stories that get adapted afterwards. So it's really interesting about what his intent was, and but you said this is not really a horror story. Would you say it's a science fiction story?
It's closer to being that, but once again, you're a million miles away from the science. I mean, even when you talk about things that are like space opera, like Star Wars, where we don't get scientific details, but it's science fiction, we don't even really get that. We barely see the lab equipment. It's an afternote. It's not critical to what's going on. Really what I look at, and I wonder if this was the inspiration, is I think it was Invisible Man quotes Plato, and the quote from Plato is something to the effect of, what would you do if you didn't have to face yourself in the mirror? Because you have this core concept of he becomes Hyde as a way of avoiding all consequence.
Right.
The guy he sees in the mirror is not the guy doing this.
Yeah, and that's a good point, because so many times people look at Jekyll and Hyde as the good guy is Jekyll and the bad guy is Hyde. It's like the two sides of the personality. But you look at the text, and he talks about having these urges and these things, and that's what led him to this experimentation about how to get rid of that.
Oh, yeah.
So Jekyll had that dark side in him.
But
And it was later versions that made it good, right?
It's not get rid of that. It's to indulge without consequence. And he actually says that in the text. This is an escape clause. I found a loophole. If I don't look like me, it doesn't blow back on me, and I can do the things I did as a youth. I was already a terrible person, but now I can be worse because I've freed myself of consequence. And that kind of makes me think about Dorian Gray.
Yes.
Because Portrait of Dorian Gray is another concept of what I do does not impact how I'm seen. And it's a very different kind of what I do does not impact how I'm seen. But I look at the two of them, and I actually had to look it up and make sure Dorian Gray came after. I wondered about that as an influence, but no, it came after.
Right. Yeah, and I think one of the first film adaptations actually combined the storylines of Jekyll and Hyde and Dorian Gray. But I hadn't seen that version.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, but it makes sense. You're right. So let's talk a little bit about the plot for people who don't know it. So you have Mr. Utterson, this lawyer, walking down, talking to his cousin, Mr. Enfield, and Enfield talks about this strange incident that he witnessed where he saw this guy, Hyde, run over a kid. And then not just run over, but then start beating the kid. I mean, that's horrific. But again, it's being told. This is secondhand knowledge. And then the people around him force him to make retribution. So he goes and gets like a paycheck and signed by Jekyll.
Yes.
And so all of a sudden you have Utterson, who's a friend of Jekyll's. He's like, what? Why would and then he realizes too that he helped him change his will, and if anything happens to Jekyll or if he disappears, all of Jekyll's money will go to Mr. Hyde. So that's the mystery. What is the connection? Is he blackmailing Jekyll? That's what spawns all this.
That's what's supposed to be the mystery, and that's why I make the argument this is meant to be a mystery story.
Yeah.
And what you're delving into is what's the relationship between these two men, but we're kept so far away from it. And once again, when you said Utterson's a friend, when we get later in the story, we're going to talk about another one of Utterson's friends, and we're going to realize Utterson's nobody's friend. He really isn't. He does not care about any human being on the planet, live or dead. He has no strong opinions about his cousin. He has no strong opinion. The closest he comes to is strong opinions about Jekyll, and he's a billion miles away from that. You know, I'm sorry, if I thought somebody was blackmailing you, Nick, I would go up to you and go, Nick, we need to talk. Can I help you with this?
I would hope so.
I would not be sitting there going, let me get some secondhand accounts when they happen to come to me.
I know.
Not a friend.
Very true. So, I mean, and that's the way it's written is kind of the strange, different points of view. So I guess, thinking of it as a mystery, maybe that's a technique that would work. Because you start saying then who's telling the truth, what's real, what are the clues that we're witnessing here.
But it's so linear. It doesn't give it. He's edging in a direction. And, I'll tell you as an author who's been in multiple genres, sometimes when you approach a new genre, you don't really understand it. And I'm saying that as somebody who can hop onto the internet and read the beginning of 400 stories, who can go to Project Gutenberg and read things that are out of copyright, who can go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble or Kobo and pick up 20 books at a reasonable price. Stevenson didn't have those kind of resources. This may have been his best attempt sitting alone in a house where he was not in a position to go and buy a book to figure out how to write a mystery. And so, once again, like I said, I would put my arm around the shoulder and say we got stuff to work on here, but we don't know what resources he really had.
Yeah. And then sometimes you wonder about motivation too, like when he kills Carew, right? There's no more. I think what stems from that is like he had gone a while without making the transformation. This is what we find later. So later we see a letter from the person who apparently witnessed the transformation. And it was so horrific that it made him like he just looked like somebody who aged overnight, and then he died. Like I guess his heart gave out, and that was Lanyon, I think. Dr. Hasty Lanyon. So he went with Hyde, and he took the potion to him. He brought it to him based on what Jekyll had told him to do. And then in front of his own eyes, he sees Hyde transform to Jekyll, and he is shocked. And that's the revelation. They're reading that account. And then you have the letter from Jekyll, who's like, in the event of my death, and that's his like confession where he talks about everything that happened. So it's like a strange way of telling the story from these different points of view. And then you see in that letter he says like he had tried to kind of stop, but he transforms automatically. Then in his sleep he turned to Hyde. He's walking down the street and he transforms into Hyde. And then the only way to go back is to take that potion again. And the science comes into it a little bit where you find out that some of the ingredients that he needed, he couldn't find a version of it. So that's where he thinks maybe things started to go a little bit awry. So at least there's an attempt to try to explain what's happening instead of just this fantasy.
But actually, you just made me think about something else I hadn't thought about. I'm going to go back in my memory. I hope I'm doing this correctly. In Beowulf, I believe the comment is made that the monster doesn't start out as a monster. The monster starts out as a person, and the evilness of that person transforms them. And that might be another incentive here, because as you're talking about, it gets to a point where it's no longer about take the formula, become Hyde. His nature becomes part of the transformation. So Beowulf may also be another of the inspirations here.
That's a good point. That's a very good point. Yeah. But that's like I said, he's trying to stop to do it, but it's like an addiction. Eventually, you can't stop. So there's a point where he had gone for a while without doing it, and then finally Hyde comes out again, and the first thing he does is he kills Carew, and then that's where he panics. He thinks he's going to get caught. So that might be an inspiration about why Hyde then would want to go back to being Jekyll. And again, unless it's that same, he's not as separated as possible. Maybe Jekyll knows exactly what he's doing.
It's not a back to it. It's which costume do I want to wear?
Exactly. I just did this evil thing, indulged in my, awful impulses, and now I can escape into Jekyll, and put on that mask.
It's exactly where you started it with. It's really not a story of a good guy and a bad guy. It's a story of an actual individual who has both elements, who's found a way to let his worst nature out without consequence, he thinks. And it's the gradual backfiring of that, the fact that that loophole closes, that he leaves too much evidence and in fact finally confesses, there is no difference.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you get his butler, Poole, who, they also see that he's locking himself up, and at one point they see him through a window, and that's he transforms and goes. So it's a lot of nice little vignettes here and there, and they check his handwriting, and the Hyde tries to. It's the same person writing it, but apparently even his handwriting can't be exactly like it is when he's Jekyll, right? So it's just really interesting.
He makes the comment he literally just slants the letters in the other direction, and it makes me wonder. I think graphology was actually very popular at the time, handwriting analysis.
Yeah,
and it's possible that he was dropping in a little bit of that, where slanting in this direction indicates a certain mental aspect, and slanting in that direction, and he may be alluding to a little bit of that, once again, in a country house where he could not look anything up and could not give you more specifics.
Yeah. And you got a little bit of Freud, right, with the ego and the superego and the id, and obviously Hyde is the id, right, that side of it. So it's the same parts, the brain, and it's really just a great concept that took people's imaginations by storm. So
the concept is solid. It's the execution.
yeah, exactly. So execution-wise, then what inspired us is maybe the play. So a year after it was published, and people were buying it, and people were reading it and really fascinated by it. An actor called Richard Mansfield reads it, and he's like, "Oh, I got to turn this into a play." So he starts coming up with expanding it into a play form, adding new characters like the fiancé and connecting Carew to that. The fiancé is the daughter of Carew and so on. So he hires this other writer called Thomas Russell Sullivan to write a 4-act play, and he starts performing it. Now, the interesting thing, I don't follow Jack the Ripper lore, but Richard Mansfield, for the longest time, was one of those people, those names that kept coming up as someone who might have been Jack the Ripper. Yeah. So I don't know if you heard any of that or not, but the timing is ironic because it's
the timing matches up. I had not heard the connection to that particular actor, but the time frame being correct, that I was aware of.
Yeah. So he wrote, and he went and did it in Boston first, and he played both parts. So that's another example. Instead of getting two actors to, they're supposed to be unidentified. People don't recognize when they see Hyde. They don't say, "Oh, Jekyll, you've had a bad day. What's happening?" Yeah. It's a completely different person. Man. Even physically, they say he's shorter and hunched over, and the face is completely different. So he got rave reviews, Richard Mansfield, for performing this. He used tricks of light and obviously the body and facial contortions to make himself look so different. He did it in Boston, then on Broadway, and then he brought it to London. And it was a month before the Whitechapel killing started. So right in that period of time. And apparently somebody wrote to the police in London, and that letter is one of the reasons why people suspect he might be one of the, I don't know if it still holds up now because others have come to prominence, but they think, people were saying, what a perfect, suspect. He's an actor.
There's a mystery. Okay. Here's an actor playing somebody who gives into his worst impulses, and people are suspect that's the bones of a good mystery.
Yeah. And then those...
Not what we got from Stevens.
And then those 5 first killings that everybody's these are the ones that really were killed by one person. Because then there were 6 others that they think maybe might have been by Jack the Ripper, but maybe not. But the play, people were accusing him at the time. So he was he started doing some comedy bits at the Lyceum Theater. And people say that he stopped doing the play because of all the accusations that he was Jack the
Well, I
Ripper.
could believe that.
But another thing was like it also wasn't making that much money, and I think he left for the Americas again. And ironically, that's when those five, the last of the five was November 9, and the play ended like in this. He stopped doing plays at the Lyceum in December of that year. So, I mean, that's
Close
why
of a great mystery. Yes.
So you see some later adaptations, and they tie in that one of the the actor could have been Jack the Ripper and everything. So whenever they do a Jack the Ripper story, they sometimes tie in that it could be this actor. Yeah. So I always thought that was a fascinating connection. But that also ties in with all these things that the Jack the Ripper. Now I'm thinking Jack the Ripper. That Jekyll and Hyde tie in. So you got like the shapeshifter. You talked about mythology. There's a lot of stories like werewolves and just people in the forest that would just shift shape, and they would never explain how they did it. It was just like they get bitten by something, but shape shifting, a person becoming something else, right? That's a genre story.
Significantly a different size, which once again Jekyll and Hyde very much plays onto that idea, though it subverts the trope because the creature, the Hyde side of it, is the smaller one.
Yeah.
Usually it's the idea, the mild-mannered man becomes the gigantic werewolf.
Exactly.
And the transformations usually work in the other direction. He may have been playing counter with that narrative. Subverting that trope can be a lot of fun. In the collection we were talking about, one of the stories that's in there includes the idea of making the monster only exist during the day. And that's that kind of subversion, which is literally take something, monster comes out at night, monster comes out at night. You see it in a million stories. Sometimes when you write the 1,000,001st story, the first thing you do is you say, what one thing can I turn on its head? And taking Hyde from large to small gives a lot of credence to your idea that it connects to things like skinwalkers and all the rest of that.
Yeah. And then there's the mad scientist trope. So you had Frankenstein that came before. And again, the Victorian era, where science was this wonderful thing, but it was also something to be feared, some of the unknown, going against the will of God. Man is greater than God, creating life and, messing around with nature, all these things that Victorians at the time were really up in arms about, right? And he kind of gave pen to that. And then the serial killer trope, right? So you wonder whether or not the actor was Jack the Ripper or not. You wonder if whoever that serial killer was, if he might have been inspired by a story like this. And then that raises questions about fiction and how writing sometimes horror, whether that brings out people, who mimic what they're reading. It's certainly, the parallels are there. I was trying to see when there were like stories about the Harp brothers in the early 1800s who had done multiple killings without a real motive. So they were known as what we would define as serial killers today. Jack the Ripper obviously was one of the more famous ones that really started getting, becoming sensationalistic, getting attention from the media, right? People following almost, these morbid thoughts of like, when will he kill again? When will he strike again? And I think Hyde certainly falls into that kind of,
and people taking the wrong lesson from literature is really deep. My friend John Frater, who co-hosts the podcast with me, is fond of the phrase, we just announced that we built the time vortex from that book called Never Build the Time Vortex.
That's it. Yeah, these are not meant to be how-to guides. These are meant to entertain or elicit emotions and fear. And I guess I asked this in some of my other, when I did Romeo and Juliet, I talked about why are we attracted to tragedies? Why are we attracted to horror? And kind of like, interesting stories like this where it's like the dark side of humanity. Do you have an opinion on that?
I have a very strong opinion about that.
Go for it.
In July, I went to StokerCon, which is the Horror Writers Association's annual convention. And the thing that struck me, and I felt this because I've interacted with a lot of people in that community, but standing with 900 of them, these are some of the kindest, most empathetic people in the world. And I realized that you can't write effective horror unless you understand how people feel. And so horror, just like romance and all these other things that are heavy emotion, they're touching something that you recognize. And horror, yes, touches things we're afraid of, but there's still things that touch us. And I think that there's a huge desire in human beings to have human connection. And when you realize how strongly we want connection, when somebody speaks to your fears, they're still speaking to you. When somebody speaks to your love, they're still speaking to you. And I think a lot of the appeal of horror is it's a way to process these things one step removed. You know, when I write a science fiction story, I can let you get 100 pages in before you realize that it's got a lot of analog to the Civil War. And because you got 100 pages in, you're not necessarily rooting for who you'd be rooting for if I had just told a straight story about the Civil War. You have an opinion as to who the good guys were. If I write a story about Nazis, you have an opinion as to who the good guys and the bad guys are in that story. If I write a story about the blue people and the red people, and 100 pages in you realize one of the sides is the Nazis. You realize one of the sides is the settlers. One of the sides is this group or that group or the other group. It forces you to have to reevaluate. And when I take your terror and I give it form, it gives you that opportunity to see it outside of yourself, to examine it, to look around it, walk around it a little bit and go, oh, I didn't see it that way when it was so direct and personal that I couldn't have any objectivity to it. It gives you some space to look at things.
Yeah, that's probably the best I've heard somebody explain that. Like that really resonates. That's really good. And the fact that it's an allegory, you talked about that, like for something else. Again, that goes back to what his wife said to him when she read it, right? She's like, this is an allegory or something else. What are you trying to say? And I think a lot of his friends, after they read it, they wrote to him too, and they said, this kind of hits close to home.
Yep. But exactly that, close to home. Things that impact us, things that we feel, are the things that we attach to that way. You know, and also, since we're talking about horror, I should also point out, when you look at something like Jekyll and Hyde, it's before we had hard genres. You look at Romeo and Juliet, when you look at all these things, a lot of the stuff you talk about, there were not hard genre definitions.
Yeah.
And I was watching Brandon Sanderson is a very good writer. I was watching a podcast that he did one time, and his comment was, genres were created by bookstores to drive traffic in directions. It's not how people write, it's how you market. And so, you know, one of the things I appreciate about what you're doing on this podcast is the fact that you're not sitting there going, okay, let's talk about this character in this genre. You're going, okay, let's talk about Charlie Brown and Snoopy, and let's talk about Romeo and Juliet, and let's talk about Jekyll and Hyde. Because what you're looking at is connection. What's the stuff that touches people? What's the stuff that years later people are still talking about? What forms part of our community and our sense of agreement?
Yeah, and how do they linger? Like what makes this character, this dual character, from a story that you rightly say isn't the best written story,
Yep.
you know? But there was something there that resonated and got people to say, wow, let's retell it. Let's do it again. Let's do other stories. And you look at other ones that were inspired by it. The Incredible Hulk comes to mind. You know, Stan Lee and Marvel and, Jack Kirby and all these other creators in the 60s when they were coming up with superheroes. You had this one great character, Dr. Banner, and suddenly the inner demon comes out. This monster comes out when he gets angry. Initially,
they got it right.
Yeah.
They got it right because the Hulk has compassion. He's got the full range of emotions. It's kind of the reversal on Jekyll and Hyde. The more complete human being is the Hulk. The Hulk is simplistic in his speech, he's simplistic in his thought, but he has the full range of emotions, and Banner is the one who's stunted into one category.
Yeah. And then the later versions written by Peter David, may he rest in peace, he really looked at the complexity, the psychological thing, where it's like the Hulk was always inside Bruce Banner.
Yes.
It took that gamma bomb to kind of bring it out. And then you see all the different facets of it, Mr. Fix-It and, the Gray Hulk and, the smart Hulk and versions. But I always like the Savage Hulk, the one, like you said, who had like limited speech, was just brute force, this power of nature that just came out of this
code of conduct in there.
Exactly.
Peter David is brilliant in the way that he brought that forward.
Yeah.
And a lot of credit for the original design, the way it was approached when it originally came out in Marvel, because they got most of it right, and they caught stuff, like you're saying, that the adaptations missed. That there is a completeness to both characters. It is not good versus evil. And there's much more complexity going on.
Yeah, and I love that. That's one of my favorite heroes. And he's an anti-hero, people really misunderstood him, and even though he smashed and wanted to get into blowing things up, and he still had that innocence that I think came from Banner, because he was Banner. So I love that, and I love the TV series.
Oh, Bill Bixby, yes.
Yeah, Bill Bixby was so great. He took it seriously.
Yes.
You empathized.
Oh, playing it straight matters so much in a
Yeah.
situation like that. I'm co-authoring something right now, and what we did is we took the silliest premise that we could come up with and said, but if you're on the inside of it, you're going to play it straight. And we're writing the whole thing that way, and the dimension that gives when you do something that's just
Yeah.
phenomenal. Yes.
Yeah. Excellent. And so we talked about shapeshifters, mad scientists, serial killers. There's also doppelgangers, right? Where it's like you see another person that looks just like you, but they're often maybe a dark side of you, evil side of you. And that's really fascinating. So not just you transforming and becoming a shapeshifter but it's almost like two different people. And
Yep.
one adaptation that comes to mind is like the episode of Star Trek, The Evil Within, with in Star Trek, to save money, they use transporters, right? That was better special effects. You couldn't do like a shuttle every time you want to go
That's
to a
what guy in the
planet.
red shirt. I'm sorry, go ahead. You were saying?
So the transporter just malfunctions and splits Captain Kirk into two. You've got
Yep.
the person that's all good but weaker, right? So his command functionality doesn't work because he doesn't want to take risks. And then you have the dark side, who's evil and drinks and almost rapes.
Yeah.
It was a great episode, right?
Yeah.
But that also shows how I think the story was like they needed each other to make the full,
Yes. You
person.
need a whole human being. I mean,
Yeah.
none of us is perfectly good. None of us is perfectly evil. I mean, there are people that make you wonder about that statement, but yeah. It becomes very complicated when you look at a person, especially when we look at people over time. What 8-year-old me did is not what 10-year-old me would do. You gain a different sense, you gain a different perspective about the world, and that's a thing that Stevenson does talk about in there when he talks
Yeah.
about the fact that one of the things that drives Dr. Jekyll is that when he was younger, he was kind of a bad guy. And he doesn't fully lose that. It evolves in the way that he approaches it. But yes, his younger self is part of that complexity. The guy who didn't understand consequences fully, so he did things, and when he understood consequence, didn't regret the behavior, he regretted the fact that he could have gotten caught.
Yeah.
So he found a way to be safer about the same wrong behavior.
And then when he starts losing control of it, when he starts changing when he doesn't want to, when he's out in public, when
Yep.
he's sleeping, that's when he starts panicking, and that's when he starts trying to. So again, it's like it's not so much, oh my goodness, I hurt this poor girl
Yep.
on the street, or oh my gosh, I killed someone. It's kind of like I'm gonna go to jail, or
Yeah.
they're gonna catch me. Yeah, so he's
it-
not. It's a much more dark, complex story than just this good guy who's doing an experiment for science.
Oh, yeah. And that's the
went
part
awry.
that supports what you were talking about with addiction. Because what's happening here is I can quit anytime I want. I can
Yeah.
control it. It only happens when I choose to have it happen. I woke up in a state. I don't trust myself anymore to not be in that state again because I'm no longer driving the bus. I'm no longer in control of it. And that is very much the addiction metaphor there.
Yeah,
So that
and then-
very strongly supports what you were talking about before.
And those blackout moments where you don't remember what you did, but hey, it was still you doing it.
Yep.
Right? So there's that thing too, where these impulses come out, and it's really an interesting story. So in terms of movies, the silent movie was done in 1920 with John Barrymore, one of the early great actors, right? And that was the one that included the picture of Dorian Gray as a story. Picture of Dorian Gray written by Oscar Wilde. I've never seen that one, but then it was used a lot. There was a satire in 1920 by one of the Keystone Cops, Hank Mann. That was a silent satire as well. Stan Laurel of the famous Laurel and Hardy team, he had a standalone movie called Dr. Pickle and Mr. Pride. So that was a silent parody of Jekyll and Hyde. The most famous one then to come was 1931, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, starring Frederick March, who won the Academy Award for Best Actor for his portrayal of both Jekyll and Hyde. And that was an interesting thing too. In it, they pronounced Jekyll as Jekyll, so it took the next movie to really make it the more standard pronunciation. And that next movie was another famous one, 1941. Spencer Tracy, Ingrid Bergman, Lana Turner. It was directed by Victor Fleming. And it was really an adaptation of the movie that we just talked about, the one with Frederick March, the one that won the. So it's funny when you see these adaptations, they're not going to the source material, they're not taking the novella, by Robert Louis Stevenson and reading it and saying, let's adapt it. They're not following that format of, Utterson walking down the street and learning about it, the mystery style. They're doing it the way it was done on the stage play with, having a strong female supporting character and having all this. So it's really interesting. Like, I think they know, like, okay, this is what the public is gravitating towards. This, they've added to the source material to make it much more entertaining and much more engaging.
Absolutely. Well, also, writing is a dialogue. You put stuff on the page and the reader brings their own stuff to it, and a lot of what they're adapting is the experience that you have from your end of the dialogue as a reader. It's got a lot of the feels it generated as opposed to the words on the page. And since we mentioned Dorian Gray, I want to read a tiny piece from the beginning, from chapter 1, because if you look at The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and then you hear this, it's like, this is the kind of writing it needed. It's your very best work, Basil. The best thing you've ever done, said Lord Henry languidly. You must be certain to send it next year to Grosvenor. The Academy is too large and too vulgar. Whenever we've gone there, we've seen either too many people, or I've not been able to see the pictures, which is dreadful, or so many pictures that I've not been able to see the people, which is worse. And then the response he gets back is, I don't think I'll send it anywhere, he answered, tossing his head back in an odd way. No, I don't think I'll send it anywhere. And he then leads this into admitting to who the subject of the painting is. This is building mystery. Okay? You should send this out. It's a gorgeous, it may be the best thing you've... No, I can't send it. Well, why can't you send it? Well, because Dorian Gray. Oh, I didn't mean to mention his name. And that's how he brings this into the story. And this is what Stevenson thinks he's doing, is he's giving you a very gradual reveal and an unfold of a mystery. And once again, Dorian Gray was written after. It's entirely possible Oscar Wilde looked at Jekyll and Hyde as one of the reasons he chose to write the way he wrote this, or wrote it at all. But you gotta look at these kind of things and go, the story idea of Jekyll and Hyde is so wildly powerful that it rose above the source material. And things like the play may be a very big part of it. And I assume you've seen Little Shop of Horrors.
Yes.
But have you seen Little Shop of Horrors, the original Robert Corman film?
No.
Okay.
And I know that's, that Jack Nicholson played, the person going to the dentist, right?
Yes.
Or the dentist, I forget which one. But yeah, that's a classic, but I haven't seen it.
Right. So what Corman wrote was small and depressing and horror, and then somebody turned it into a bright musical about cannibal plants. And it's the same way if you watch La Cage aux Folles. Yeah. This is one of the most depressing films you will ever watch in your life, and somebody looked at that and said, Birdcage, we need Robert Williams and Nathan Lane, and this will pop. Let's get Gene Hackman in drag. This is going to work for us. And somehow that did. Yeah. So when somebody went in, as you said, and took it and said, I like the bones of this, but I'm not doing the material, I think that may be one of the reasons we still talk about it. Because I think you're right. I think it's where the adaptations come from. And I think it's where a lot of the love comes from. I don't think Stevenson got us to love Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I think one fan of Stevenson's paying to write a fanfic version of it that he performed on stage had a lot more to do with it. I think you're very, very correct in that, Nick.
Yeah, and that's why I love adaptations. And obviously within, fair use and licensing and, pay the writer, that the ideas come from. I always believe in that. But you get so many different takes on those characters, and sometimes they go a little too far and they don't fit what the character was about, but other times it's really interesting. So with Jekyll and Hyde, you've had versions where Jekyll is more like, not the most handsome and not the most and then suddenly they take the potion and they become this debonair, tall, so they've done those versions. They've done versions where, it's interesting that the first version didn't have any female characters in it that were of significance, and they've done versions where it's either the woman is Dr. Jekyll or the Dr. Jekyll, the man, takes the potion and becomes Hyde, the woman, right?
Yes.
So that's always a play on gender, a play on, so taking the source material and playing with it and seeing what happens, right? There was a blaxploitation version, which was Dr. Black and Mr. Hyde, right? There were comedies, right? Abbott and Costello Meet Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, where Boris Karloff, I think, played Jekyll. Yeah. And he didn't play Hyde, though. That's an interesting point. I would have liked to have seen him do that. Sequels, The Son of Jekyll. the Hammer films. So there was three of them: the Ugly Duckling, there was the Two Faces of Dr. Jekyll, and they did Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde. So they played on the gender roles there. And then more recently, 1995, there was Dr. Jekyll and Ms. Hyde. That was with Tim Daly and Sean Young, and they played that as a comedy. There's a lot of versions, going through it.
And
go ahead.
going back to that original play, the whole idea of an actor looking at it and I want to play both roles really speaks to me. And I know you have a connection to theater also, but the idea of being able to sit there and go, I'm going to be this character, and then I'm going to be this character, dramatically enough that it's going to hold tension to the audience that these are two different characters, theoretically by different actors, is a very powerful lore.
Yeah.
I did a table read of a 90s radio play with Teal James Glenn and Carol Geisander, and each of us has one scene where we get to have two different characters' voices. We have to talk to ourselves. And that is the most fun part of it. And when I watch people react, because we've done this live, that's the most fun part for the audience, is when I'm like, well, driver over there. But monsieur, are you sure? As soon as they see you do that one little nod, they're completely with you. And when Teal does it, and Carol does it, when I do it, each of us got our little section. It just stops everyone and it hits the audience very, very strongly and positively. And that may be a big part of the appeal, is all the places where it was one actor, where they got to do it, especially on stage where you don't have, okay, we'll stop the camera, we'll put you in 2 hours of makeup, but literally the transformation's on you.
Right in front of the audience, right.
And you have to do all that live, yes.
Exactly. Yeah, so that's a great segue to then the later theater adaptation on Broadway, the musical Jekyll and Hyde, which debuted in the 1990s and has been playing for various times off and on. People like Robert Cuccioli, Jack Wagner from the soap operas, Sebastian Bach from Skid Row, David Hasselhoff, he played him, Constantine Maroulis, all very campy in some ways because there's that one song where he's changing back and forth. So a good actor, some of the earlier ones like Robert Cuccioli really nailed it, where it's like, wow, seeing it live, his long hair slicked back when he's Jekyll and then hanging over his face when he's Hyde. And just, it works if you can do it right. You see it sometimes, and I don't want to knock David Hasselhoff because he's entertaining, but it becomes campy, it becomes funny. So it depends. But this is one where I think you could go and see the Hasselhoff version. It's streaming. If you see it live, it's really great music. And again, it plays up on the stage version where, a lot of the Jack the Ripper metaphors go in there too as well. But yeah, somebody was like, okay, it worked as a stage play, let's turn it into a musical,
Well, I don't know if you've gotten to see it. Did you get to see Operation Mincemeat when it was on Broadway?
No,
right,
but
so
I keep getting ads for it because I saw it on the Tonys, that song that got performed.
My friend Jen treated me to it as a favor trade, and we went to see it. And it's 5 actors, and there are places where they jump off stage and come back in different costumes, and it's only 5 actors. They make a big deal about it. But there's also scenes where it's like, I think you should realize that it's different. And they've keyed the audience into the costume changes enough that the removal of the hat, you're with them. And it works 1,000,000,000%. So yes, that whole concept is just breathtakingly fun.
Yeah, and like when I see actors like John Leguizamo, they could do a one-person show playing 50 characters. And each one is distinct and each one is... That's part of the joy of acting. And, it just can show you that someone can have multiple personalities and still be the same person,
Yes, it very much touches on that.
There were TV adaptations. So many people, it's one of those, I guess, how do you define a great character? Is that so many performers want to perform. So Kirk Douglas, Adam West did a spoof for the Night Gallery series, right? There, back in the days of live TV, there was a show called Climax, an anthology series. So Gore Vidal did an adaptation of it. So it's one of those things that people just kept coming back for. And then there were book adaptations and spin-offs. The Mary Riley, which I hadn't read the novel, and I haven't seen the version with Julia Roberts and John Malkovich, but that was a big hit. Again, telling it from the point of view of the maid and what she witnessed and saw. Comic book adaptation. So Alan Moore and Kevin O'Neill did The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, So that whole comic series, which lasted for years, right? It was so what a great concept that is, taking all these literary characters like Captain Nemo and Alan Quatermain and Dr. Jekyll and turning them into the superhero group that had to go and protect the Empire, right? So just really fascinating. And that seemed more like they played in that movie, especially, they turned Jekyll and Hyde into like a version of Banner and the Hulk.
Yeah.
You know?
Very much so.
Yeah. It's been used in music. So The Who had a song called Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Men at Work had Dr. Heckle and Mr. Jive. That was catchy. Ozzy Osbourne had Bark of the Moon, which always I felt more was like about werewolves, but you look at the video that he made and it was totally Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Judas Priest did one. So it inspires people to tell these stories. And I, from a pop culture point of view, there's this great restaurant that we used to go to in the 90s called Jekyll and Hyde Club. So it was a very, gothic horror motif design, right? Very dark, like you're going into a haunted castle. The food was forgettable, but it was the experience of going into this kind of, haunted, scary kind of place with monsters around every corner. But, it still stands today. What else can you say about the character? Or, if it was written today, do you think any of those kind of tropes that he used, like the letters, I guess you would have text messages nowadays to tell the story and move the plot along?
You could still theoretically do it with letters, but I mean, it's not even that. If I wrote it today set in that time period, I would still write almost every word of it differently. If you're looking at a story like this, first of all, now, like I said, we are now genred. We now need to adhere to certain standards, because when I look at the spine of a book and it says mystery, I have expectations. And as a writer, you need to meet your reader's expectations. You can subvert them to some degree. You can bring in things from other genres. Everybody does. But you owe it to the person who looked at the spine and saw nonfiction for there to be nonfiction inside. They saw horror to see horror inside. So one of the first questions would be, what genre is this really being written in? And if I was writing this as a mystery, and we're going to accept the conceit that this is intended to be a mystery, there would be many more pages. This would have to be at least a novel, because you need red herrings.
Yeah.
If the mystery is, what is the relationship between these two men, then there needs to be credible arguments for other relationships that are much stronger than the ones that are in the story. And by today's muster, that's not a mystery story. That's not even a cozy mystery story. And then on the other side of it, if you're going to make it a true mystery as to who is Mr. Hyde, how did he end up connected here, you need him to be connected to more than Jekyll, so that there's a wider range, so that we wonder what vector did he come into society, because he clearly is not part of society. And then the entire class structure of it would be treated differently than it is now, because the de facto in Stevenson's time is, oh, you're upper class, therefore you're honorable. And even that gets a little bit of a gut punch from our main character, to go back to what I was saying before about he's nobody's friend. When the MP dies, he basically goes, he's a client of mine, but you're also a client of mine, so what story are we telling? Not, oh my god, he's been murdered, if you're his murderer I can't speak to you. Not, I am horrified to be in the same room as somebody who killed my friend the MP. None of that's there. What's there is, okay, so I'm your lawyer, let's get together on a story here. He's not anybody's friend. And that would be massively built up if this was going to be written today. If you're going to create a character who's got that kind of morally gray life, where they're completely out of the idea of good and evil and just literally in the practicality of what it affects on them, you'd play that character very differently. They would be much more of a focus. They would be freighted with allegory for modern people that we have issues with that are like that. We would see something in a whole other vein. I mean, there's been so many adaptations, as you pointed out, lots of them. I don't know that we need another one. I was watching a commentary, and I forget whose comment it was, but essentially it was the only way you could really write Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde nowadays as a mystery, because everyone knows the twist,
Everybody
is to
knows
go as far into the book as you could before anyone realizes you're writing Jekyll and Hyde.
That's a great point.
And that's pretty much, like I said, not mine, but that is pretty much the way that it would have to be approached. Yeah. If you're going to do something like that today, to your point about how iconic it is, the answer is don't do that. Because if your goal is to produce something iconic, you need to start from another principle. You need to start from another place, or you need enough distance from that concept that you can play the duality but do it in some other way. As you pointed out, Star Trek took it on. It was not a Jekyll and Hyde story at all. It did not have the same impetus. It did not have the same motivation, but it had the core concept of separation, which, as you also pointed out, isn't really the story of Jekyll and Hyde.
Correct.
It's just the one a lot of people think they have. I ticked off an author horribly one time. I read their manuscript and I went on and on about loving this one scene that's not in there. There are two scenes that collectively had merged in my mind. Everything I was talking about, the author had put on the page, but this is in this chapter and this is in this chapter over here. But as a reader, they became one scene. And that's a lot of what we experience with literature. And it's a lot of why these adaptations are different, is because you're seeing what you're seeing. You're not necessarily seeing what I put on the page. And, I always say the pathology of writing is I have the whole story, but only some of it made it out of my brain. And my job is to make sure enough of it made it out of my brain that you get not necessarily my story, but a story, that you get your experience from it.
Yeah. And this is where I think people who read it maybe after seeing all these adaptations might be like, well, where's the fiance and where's this and that? It's like... It's amazing what sticks with us after all these times. J. Michael Straczynski adapted it for Nightmare Classics. There's been animated versions. Michael Caine has played him. DeGray Scott. Mickey Rooney had his last performance in a Jekyll and Hyde movie. He didn't play Jekyll or Hyde. He played a character called Mr. Lewis. But that's, it just shows again the depth of adaptations that have been done. Anything we've left out? Anything you want to say about the whole Jekyll and Hyde, how it's impacted pop culture over the years, or horror writing, or anything?
It does become interesting that way because we are genred now. So when you talk about Mary Shelley and Frankenstein, when you talk about Jekyll and Hyde, there's certain, and this is actually your pitch to me when we were talking about this, there are certain foundational stories that have formed a lot of what we look at, but I think we can kind of overvalue that. Because if you look at all of human history, there are stories that become foundational to horror. We're talking about Beowulf, where literally the level of evil somebody reaches transforms them out of being human. And the whole idea of dehumanizing the other is a horrific part of human history. It's used to let the worst atrocities happen. It is how you get almost every attempt at genocide. It's how you get almost every war. They're not people because good people wouldn't shoot people, therefore they can't be. And those kind of things are core to the human soul and are core to the horror experience, because if we go back to the definition that horror is something that touches you emotionally, a lot of horror comes not from literature, not from anything else. Its predecessor is the soup that is your brain. It's all the chemicals that are in you that make you react certain ways. Core to horror is fight or flight. Horror is all these very fundamental things. And yes, you get iconic moments, and I would strongly argue that Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is much strongly iconic than Jekyll and Hyde. But once again, it's a story of let's create an other. Let's create somebody where the question is human? And Jekyll and Hyde does that beautifully with Hyde, and Mary Shelley does that beautifully with the monster. I mean, beautifully with the monster. And a lot of horror comes down to those kind of things. Ghosts are used to be human. Werewolves are sometimes human. Vampires are used to be human. Zombies are used to be human. There's a tremendous amount of it that just comes down to that basic concept. And so I would sooner say that Robert Louis Stevenson tapped into it than that he was foundational to it. I think what Mary Shelley did was so transformative that the only place I can go back to before Frankenstein's monster and come anywhere close is the word golem. The whole idea of homunculus golem constructed humans that way, but she still doesn't even do that because those are clay. She takes actual body parts. She takes actual parts of other people and kind of asks the question, if I take your knee and his elbow, is this either of you? And very strongly says, no, it's something new. And that's much more revolutionary than almost everything else she does, is to basically say, you are not your parts. And I think that's overlooked a lot, but that's an incredible statement for a human being to make. Your body is not you. And to me, that's much more impressive about what she's done.
Yeah, so I mean, Shelley took this challenge to write a horror story, wrote this gothic horror
Yes.
masterpiece and invented a genre. I would think
Yes.
I mean, I agree with those who say it's probably the first science fiction story. There's others before, little things here and there, but what would you say Robert Louis Stevenson, what do you think is, if it's not the writing itself or the way he told, is it just the idea? Like, what is it that, made this so, even the characters, even Jekyll himself is not very likable,
Yep.
like, so, the later adaptations kind of made him more likable and more tortured.
Well, I think it's the touch of, it really comes down to the idea of, if you didn't have to look at yourself in the mirror, what would you do? And he encapsulates that so well in Hyde. In the part of it is also, if you look at the narrator's non-reaction to Hyde, how little he's horrified by it. So I think there's a little corner in the human soul that goes, if I could be a terrible person and nobody would much care, I don't necessarily have to put these filters on myself. I don't have to put these restrictions on myself. And it's a part we don't want to admit to.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think that his encapsulating that and letting it sit in society the way he did, I think that may be the thing that put it into the mindset then. And then if you take that and you add the adaptations, because, yeah, to your point, I don't think most people who talk about Jekyll and Hyde have read the source material.
Right.
And you run into this with almost everything. The number of people you will run into who will talk about the Bible who haven't read the Bible. Number of people you'll run into who know the Frankenstein story because they saw one movie once that they slept through half of, but they know the story.
Yeah.
So I don't know how much we credit the author. As an author, I'm horrified to say it, but I don't know how much we credit the author with the popularity of it. I think he put a character into popular consciousness. Everyone took it however they wanted to take it. Then the adaptations came out which gave more license for exactly that, and he became everybody's character. And I think that's a big part of it.
Yeah. And I wonder if that original way that he, as much as we critique him, you wonder if that really was a poignant choice that he made to kind of tell the story from people perceiving Jekyll and perceiving Hyde instead of telling it through their eyes as the protagonists.
But if he was doing that, he should have done it stronger.
Exactly.
I
don't disagree with you there.
There's a good story in there. There's so much. Like I said, I wish he was in my writing group. I could help him. Most writers could help. I don't know, special about me. Most writers could help him. He needed to go through critique. He needed that to have a couple of beta readers. He needed that to have a little space and time to breathe.
Yeah, and I would give more credit to Robert Mansfield for the play, in 1887.
Yes.
But he might be Jack the Ripper, so I don't know if I should praise him that much or not.
I'm going to go with we can separate the art from the artist when the artist is no longer profiting.
I know. And if he's not Jack the Ripper, it still would make a great story. So,
yeah.
I mean, I know they've mentioned it already, but somebody needs to adapt it into a bigger story. So,
when are you writing it? My plate's full. When are you writing?
I know. And I'm shocked that you had time to join me with all the things on your plate. So let me remind everybody again. Charles Baruch, my guest today.
Yep.
He's got Theo Starr versus Culver Gang. That's the new Western that he wrote as David Baruch. There's the new horror collection on Amazon that he's holding up against Shadows Without Light. And he is one of the hosts of Horror Words Podcast. Check it out. He's got the QR code right there. Go look at it. It's free, of course. Just check it out. Great episodes. Leave comments and subscribe, not just to Horror Words Podcast, but also to Greatest Characters in Pop Culture History. I would love to hear what you think. What did we leave out? What else can we talk about? And what do you disagree with? Now, I'm sure we said things that you probably like, wait a second, let me interject. So thank you, Charles, for joining me. Thank you all. And I hope to see you again next time here on Greatest Characters in Pop Culture History.